An old golden retriever was left to freeze in the snow. 1 year old, ribs showing, limping from old wounds, his golden fur matted with blood and snow. Thrown from a truck like garbage onto a bridge no one walked anymore. No name, no collar, just silence and the cold creeping into his bones. And no one came. Until a 10-year-old boy pressed his face to a frosted window and saw something no child should ever have to see. A dog waiting to die. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe animals deserve love, not pain, hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. Maple Creek was the kind of town most people passed through without stopping. Tucked in the folds of pine-covered hills in northern Colorado, its streets were quiet, its rooftops dusted with snow, and its river ran slow and black beneath a wooden bridge older than most of its residents. It was late December, and the cold had a weight to it, an ancient, silent pressure that wrapped the town in frost and made every window glow a little softer. A light snow was falling, gentle but persistent, blanketing the roadways in powder. There were no sounds except the wind threading through bare branches and the creak of tires on weathered wood. A rusted blue pickup rolled slowly onto the wooden bridge at the edge of town, its taillights dim through the mist. The truck had seen better decades, its fenders rust-pocked, muffler rattling with each wheel rotation. It came to a sudden, unceremonious halt at the midpoint of the bridge. The driver didn't step out. Instead, the back door of the cab cracked open, and something hit the icy planks with a low, painful thump. That something was a dog. He hit the ground hard, legs folding beneath him. For a long moment he didn't move. The truck door slammed shut, and the engine growled as the vehicle pulled away into the mist. The bridge was empty once more. And there, beneath the falling snow, lay Sonny. Sonny was about 1 year old, though his small frame made him look younger. He was a golden retriever, or what was left of one. His once thick fur was patchy, tangled with old dirt and new blood. His ribs jutted beneath the skin, and his hind leg bore a faint but healing scar, a long, pink line that cut through golden fur like a cruel whisper. He had soft eyes, dark and round, but they were dulled by exhaustion and fear. They darted after the fading red glow of the truck's taillights before he lowered his head and curled up instinctively, trying to disappear into himself. He had not always been this broken. The snow began to thicken. Sonny's breath came in trembling puffs, each one visible against the night air. A gust of wind blew snow over his curled body, but he didn't flinch. He had learned stillness. Movement brought attention. Attention brought pain. So he waited, because waiting was all he knew. In a house not far from the bridge, a boy stood in his upstairs bedroom, forehead pressed to the cold window. The boy's name was Eli. Eli was 10, slight of build, with ash-brown hair that curled at the ends, and hazel eyes that carried too much silence for someone his age. He wore an oversized flannel shirt and wool socks that slipped off his heels. He was not the kind of boy who laughed loudly or interrupted conversations. He watched things. Not out of shyness, but out of something older, something learned. A kind of patience, born from loss. It had been only 2 weeks since Max, his old golden retriever, had been put down. Kidney failure. The house still smelled faintly of dog shampoo and peanut butter biscuits. His mom had buried Max's old toys in a box in the garage, but Eli knew where it was. Every night since, he'd found himself by the window, staring out at the bridge in the distance, as if Max might come running back over it. Tonight, something stirred on that bridge. It was small and hunched, barely visible through the snow, but Eli's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer. Was that a dog? Mom? He whispered into the quiet. No reply. He padded to the hallway and peeked into her bedroom. The light was off, her breathing slow and even. Sarah, his mother, was a nurse at the Maple Creek Clinic, tall, slender, and always exhausted since her shifts had doubled. Her hair was the same color as Eli's, though she wore it tied back in a loose bun that frayed at the sides. Grief sat on her shoulders like an old scarf. Her kindness remained, but it was quieter now. Eli tiptoed back to his room, pulled on his boots without socks, and wrapped his winter coat around his flannel shirt. He reached for the doorknob. The hall light snapped on. Eli. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired, but it froze him in place. Sarah stood at the end of the hallway, her face pale from the light, arms crossed over a robe. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. I think there's a dog on the bridge." She stepped forward, glanced out his bedroom window and sighed. "It's freezing, sweetheart. Could be a coyote or just your imagination." "I saw it," Eli said, more firm now. "It looked hurt." Sarah knelt in front of him. Her hands rested gently on his shoulders. "I know you miss Max," she said, her voice catching for just a second. "But we can't go chasing shadows in the middle of the night." Eli's eyes dropped. What if someone left him out there? Sarah looked at the bridge again, the snow, the night. Something flickered behind her eyes, worry, hesitation. Then she rose. "If it's still there in the morning, we'll check. I promise." But Eli didn't sleep, neither did Sonny. The snow piled up around the dog's frame, softening the lines of his body until he looked like a lump of forgotten laundry. His eyes blinked slowly, then not at all. Time dissolved. From his window, Eli sat cross-legged, blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He watched and waited, and Sonny did the same, two souls separated by frost and glass, neither knowing that fate had already tied a thread between them. By morning, the snow had crusted into a thin sheet of ice. The bridge stood still and empty, except for faint paw prints that led away toward the heart of Maple Creek. Sonny had risen just before dawn, his joints stiff, the pain in his back leg throbbing with every step. The hunger gnawed at him, and though his instincts told him to hide, something stronger pulled him forward, the faint scent of food carried on the breeze, and the faint warmth of chimneys in the distance. He moved slowly, one paw dragging slightly, each breath rising in small clouds that vanished before they could warm his fur. The town center of Maple Creek was still asleep. Rows of old brick buildings lined the quiet main street, most with hand-painted signs and weather-worn shutters. Christmas decorations dulled by snow, and time hung limply from lamp-posts. Among them stood a small auto repair shop with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Walters Auto and Repair," since 1979. A single light flickered behind the dusty glass window, and smoke curled from a tin chimney in the back. Sonny limped toward it, his legs giving out just short of the front steps. He collapsed, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. His ribs showed even more clearly in daylight, his fur stained in places with old grime and dried blood. His right eye was slightly swollen from a past injury. He didn't cry, he didn't bark. He simply lay there, chest rising and falling like it had given up keeping time. Inside, Walter Hargrove had just finished his morning coffee. He was a wiry man in his early 70s with a neatly trimmed gray beard and hands permanently stained with grease and memory. He wore an old olive flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans and thick-soled boots. His eyes, light blue, always slightly squinting, had a weariness not just from age, but from years of solitude. Walter had once been jovial, the kind who fixed things for free and handed out peppermints to kids waiting with their parents. But since his wife June passed 3 years ago from ovarian cancer, something inside him had grown quiet. He kept his shop open, mostly for routine. He didn't need the money, only the movement. When he opened the shop door to take out the trash, he stopped mid-step. Lying in front of him was a dog, motionless, except for its shallow breaths. Walter narrowed his eyes and stepped closer. What the he muttered. Sonny didn't move. Walter crouched down slowly, not reaching out but looking. "You've had a bad time, haven't you, boy?" he said softly, almost more to himself than to the dog. Sonny flinched but didn't pull away. Walter stood, disappeared inside, and returned with a metal bowl filled with warm rice, bits of chicken, and broth left over from his own dinner reheated. He placed it gently beside the dog. "If you've got enough left, and you try that." Sonny sniffed at tongue, darting out once-twice. He ate a few hesitant mouthfuls, then stopped, curling back in on himself, like the world might steal even that comfort. Walter watched for a long minute before going back inside. He grabbed an old flannel blanket from the storage rack and returned to drape it carefully over Sonny's back. The dog didn't protest, only gave a low exhale barely audible. Walter stood there another moment, hands in pockets, before muttering, "You're welcome," and disappearing into the shop. By mid-morning, the snow began to melt slightly along the edges of the sidewalks. Inside the warmth of his small kitchen above the shop, Walter kept glancing out the window. He told himself not to get attached. Told himself the dog would probably leave as soon as he got some strength back. But his hands trembled slightly when he went back to work beneath the hood of a rusty truck. He hadn't spoken to anyone at length in days. That night, the streets were silent again. Street lamps buzzed faintly as fog crept in from the pines. Sonny had not moved far. Walter had made up a corner in the shop's side shed, cleaned out some old boxes, laid down more blankets, even added a small heater that hummed lowly. Sonny rested there, head on paws, eyes blinking slowly, as the warmth settled into his bones for the first time in weeks. Across town, Eli lay in bed. He hadn't told his mother what he saw the night before. She had been too tired from her shift to ask questions, but he hadn't stopped thinking about the dog, the way it had curled in the snow, the way its eyes, though hollow, still held something that pulled at his chest. At midnight, Eli slipped quietly from under his blanket. He wore his coat over his pajamas and tiptoed across the hardwood floor, avoiding the creaky step outside his mother's room. He clutched something in his hand, a folded blue cloth frayed at the edges. It was Max's old blanket, the one they used to lay by the fire. He hadn't let his mother throw it out. Eli crept through the side door and into the cold. The air was sharper than the night before, the fog thicker. He walked slowly toward the repair shop, guided by the soft yellow glow from a back window. The town was still. When he reached the side of the shop, he saw the shape of the dog curled on a pile of blankets. Sonny stirred slightly, sensing the boy's approach but not reacting aggressively. Eli knelt nearby, carefully unfolding the old cloth and placing it at the edge of the shed. He didn't try to pet the dog, didn't call to him, just laid the blanket down and whispered, "This was my dog's. He'd want you to have it." Sonny raised his head slightly. His nose twitched. He sniffed the cloth once, then lowered his head again, resting it near the edge of the worn blue square. Eli sat beside him for a few minutes, silent. Then he stood and walked back into the fog. It had been 3 days since Sonny arrived at Walter's shop. The snow outside had turned into slush by afternoon, melting just enough to reveal patches of old grass and gravel. Sonny was no longer shivering constantly, and though his ribs still showed beneath his coat, there was color in his eyes again, a soft, guarded awareness. He didn't run when Walter entered the shed anymore. He didn't flinch when the old man set down his meals or muttered about the radio static. He didn't wag his tail either, but that would take time. Walter had grown used to Sonny's presence, though he didn't admit it aloud. He'd even taken to calling him Kid under his breath, a name once reserved for stray cats that loitered near the shop. But Sonny had been scrawled faintly on the faded cloth tag still attached to the frayed collar the dog wore. Walter had noticed it the second day while gently wiping mud off the dog's neck. Sonny, he'd read aloud. "Not much sunshine in you, huh?" That afternoon, while Walter replaced a spark plug in the garage, Sonny lay curled beneath the heat lamp in the shed. The rain had stopped. The air outside was still holding its breath in that peculiar way only the forest could. The trees behind the repair shop stretched deep into the hills, black firs and crooked pines that swallowed sound. Walter had warned kids not to play near them, saying coyotes came too close when it snowed. It was nearly dusk when Sonny stirred. His ears twitched, catching something faint beneath the whir of Walter's toolbox. At first it was a distant rustle. Then it came again, soft, high-pitched, and uneven. A sound he remembered far too well, pain. He lifted his head. Another whimper, followed by a tiny yelp. Sonny rose slowly, his injured leg stiff. The whimper grew clearer, frantic, desperate, coming from the woods. Without hesitation, Sonny limped from the shed, pushing through the narrow opening at the back of the lot, where the chain-link fence had rusted through. The forest met him with shadow and silence. Snow still clung to the bases of trees, and the wet earth soaked his paws as he moved forward, nose low, ears up. He found the source near a rotted log, where the trees grew so tightly they filtered out most of the fading light. There, curled into a trembling ball beneath an old pine, was a puppy. It couldn't have been more than 10 weeks old. A mutt, by the looks of it, short brown fur with white paws, floppy ears, and eyes squeezed shut. A thin nylon rope had been tied loosely around its neck and tethered to the tree's base. Whoever had left it hadn't even bothered to secure the knot tightly. The pup's body shook with cold, and its tail was tucked so tightly beneath its belly it was barely visible. One of its front legs had a raw scrape along the joint, as if it had fallen and dragged itself through ice. Sonny approached slowly. The pup whimpered louder, then rustling from the nearby bushes. A red fox, lean and hungry, crept low from the underbrush. Its amber eyes locked onto the tiny bundle of fur, nose twitching. The fox was mangy, its ribs prominent, its coat ragged. It moved with caution, but intent, testing the air, edging forward. Sonny didn't growl. He stepped between the pup and the predator, lowering his head, shoulders tense. His body still hurt, and he knew he couldn't run if this turned into a chase. But he didn't back down. The fox paused, calculating. It took a step closer. Then Sonny barked. It was not a loud bark, not like the ones he'd used before the pain, but it was sharp, purposeful, a warning. The fox blinked, startled by the sound in this quiet place. Sonny barked again, louder this time, his stance firm, despite the tremble in his legs. The fox froze, then turned. It slunk backward, disappearing into the thicket with a flick of its tail. Gone. Sonny waited, eyes still fixed on the brush. When it remained still, he turned back to the puppy, who had quieted and now peeked through a crack in its eyelids. Sonny sniffed the knot, then carefully pawed it loose. The rope fell away. He nudged the pup gently, coaxing it to rise. The little dog staggered to its feet, unsteady and weak. Sonny licked its ear, once then turned, and began limping back through the trees. The puppy followed on wobbly legs, stopping every few steps but always watching Sonny. It took longer to return than it had to leave. By the time the pair reached the edge of the repair lot, the sky had gone indigo and Walter was outside, flashlight in hand. "Kid," he called gruffly, the worry in his voice poorly hidden. Then he saw the two of them. "Well, I'll be," Walter muttered. He knelt, flashlight beam softening as it fell on the trembling puppy. "Where'd you find him, huh?" he said, eyes flicking from Sonny to the pup. "You got a thing for strays now." He scooped the little one up, careful, gentle, and cradled it against his chest. Poor thing's frozen half stiff. He looked at Sonny, who stood panting, sides heaving. "You too, huh?" Inside the shed, Walter laid the puppy on a folded towel and filled a small bowl with warm milk and mashed oatmeal. Sonny lay beside the towel, watching with eyes half closed. He didn't touch the food Walter brought for him that night. He stayed there instead, pressed close to the pup, whose head eventually nestled beneath Sonny's chin. Walter sat outside the shed on an old crate, the flashlight beside him, casting a golden halo on the frosted ground. He watched the two animals in silence. Behind him, the forest had gone still. Morning in Maple Creek rose gray and dripping a dull sleet, tapping on the cracked skylight above Walter's workbench, while pale steam curled from the radiator pipes. Inside the shed, the space smelled faintly of motor oil, damp blanket, and warm porridge. Sonny had spent the night curled around the rescued puppy, but as daylight seeped through the warped boards, he lifted his head, ears swiveling at every unfamiliar creak, and decided the little one, still trembling from cold and fear, could not stay hidden in shadows. He gripped the slack rope that had once tethered the pup, now little more than a muddy cord, and began to drag it across the slick cement. Each tug sent a jolt through the half-healed scar along his haunch. He winced, but pressed on, guiding the pup tiny moss brown with a stripe of white down the muzzle toward the larger garage bay. The puppy's paws slid on the wet floor, but it blinked at Sonny with a mixture of awe and unquestioning trust, then stumbled after him, ribs sharp beneath patchy fur. The howl of a distant logging truck vibrated through the corrugated walls as Sonny reached the threshold and collapsed, exhausted muzzle still clenched on the rope like a tattered banner of survival. Walter Hargrove had been bent over the engine of a cherry-red GMC Trouble Light, casting his lined face in gold when he heard the faint scrape. He straightened, wiping grease onto a frayed shop rag, and saw an image that tore straight through 3 years of practiced detachment. The golden dog, leaner than any retriever, should be lying drenched on the floor beside a pup scarcely bigger than a jackrabbit. Walter's blue eyes widened. He swore softly and knelt, his knees popping. "Kid, what in blazes have you done?" He reached first for the puppy, mindful of the raw scrape at its elbow, and felt its frail heartbeat flutter against his palm. With the other hand, he stroked the ridge of Sonny's neck gently, the way one eases voltage through old wires. Sonny did not flinch. His eyes tracked Walter's every move, but held no panic now, only a wary hope that surprised the old man, the look of someone who wanted permission to believe. Walter scooped both animals onto a quilted moving blanket, carried them to the small break-room kitchenette, and warmed leftover chicken broth on an electric burner. The puppy lapped greedily, dribbling broth onto its paws. Sonny took slower sips, pausing at intervals to nose the pup's ear, as if reminding it to breathe. Walter saw scars beneath Sonny's damp coat, raised lines like bad handwriting across his ribs, and felt a thud of anger for whoever had etched them. Outside, sleet had turned to a fine icy drizzle when Eli Carter pushed open the side door. He wore a navy beanie too large for his narrow-faced cheeks, flushed from jogging the half-mile after school. His hazel eyes, still edged with the sadness of recent loss, lit instantly at the sight of Sonny upright and the puppy nibbling at a bowl. "You found him," Eli breathed, voice cracking between relief and wonder. Walter, straightening his spine against the countertop, gave a small grunt. "Looks like your golden knight here did the finding. I just provided the dishes." Eli removed his soaked gloves and approached, slowly remembering to crouch sideways, so as not to loom something he had read in a library book about timid animals. He studied the puppy-shortened muzzle-round skull paw pads, pink from cold. "He needs a name," Eli murmured, fingers hovering before settling lightly on the pup's head. The puppy sneezed, then smacked tiny jaws around Eli's thumb in a harmless gum bite. Eli laughed an unguarded, bright sound that startled even him. "Toby," he declared, thinking of a character from a picture book he once loved, a brave mouse that survived against impossible odds. Sonny watched his hand's tail, giving a single tentative sweep before resting again. Their quiet moment was broken by the hiss of Walter's old kettle. He poured broth into a chipped mug for himself. He subsisted almost entirely on broth and instant coffee these days, and observed the boy. Eli's lank frame and oversized jacket made him look smaller than 10, but there was something deliberate in the way he stroked both dogs, as if cataloging each breath to memory. Walter cleared his throat. "You skipped class?" he asked gruffly. Eli shook his head. "I came right after the bell. Mom's on evening shift." He hesitated. "Can I help?" The old mechanic eyed the grease under his nails. Then the earnestness carved into the boy's slight shoulders. "Hand me those towels. Let's dry them proper." Side by side they worked, Eli toweling Sonny's belly, whispering encouragement, Walter rubbing warmth into Toby's paws. When the dogs were swaddled in clean rags, Sonny rested his chin on Eli's knee, and the boy's expression turned fragile and luminous all at once, like glass catching sunrise. Walter pretended not to notice the tears. Eli blinked away. Late afternoon stretched into early dusk. Walter rigged a small pen from milk crates and plywood in the corner nearest the space heater, spreading fresh sawdust and an old quilt across the floor. Toby waddled inside, made 3 unsteady circles, and fell asleep against Sonny's flank. The golden retriever's breathing slowed, eyelids drooping, even as he fought to keep watch. Walter dimmed the overhead bulb and motioned Eli to follow him into the office, a cramped room lined with faded service manuals and photographs of classic cars. There, beneath the window, sat a stub-spined notebook and a ballpoint pen. Eli opened it carefully. The first page bore yesterday's date and a single line in neat, tentative handwriting. "Day 1, I saw him on the bridge alone in the snow." Eli turned to a blank page, chewed the pen cap, and wrote, "Day 3. Sonny brought Toby home. He is braver than anyone says a dog can be." Walter, reading over his shoulder, cleared his throat again, but said nothing. He recognized the ritual of writing pain into story. It was the same thing he did with carburetors and timing belts, putting the broken pieces back together so they hummed. He placed a hand the size of a spanner on Eli's shoulder. "Keep that up," he said softly. "Dogs remember kindness." Evening shadows bled across the windows. Eli knew he had to return before Sarah finished her rounds. He tucked the notebook into his backpack and pulled the collar of his coat high. At the shed entrance, he paused, kneeling to kiss Toby's forehead and scratch gently behind Sonny's ear. "See you tomorrow," he whispered. Sonny exhaled a sound almost like a sigh of contentment and closed his eyes, trusting the boy to come back, trusting the world for one small night. Walter locked the door behind Eli and watched the boy jog down the empty street, his figure blurring into sleet. The mechanic turned, listened to the slow, even breathing of the 2 dogs, and for the first time in 3 years reached to switch on the dusty Christmas lights strung across the window. Tiny red bulbs flickered hesitantly, then glowed, casting a warm halo over the sleeping forms. Walter stood in their glow mug, cradled between cracked palms, and felt the shop, his lonely grease-scented sanctuary, shift almost imperceptibly toward something like home. The skies over Maple Creek were a pale, windless gray, the kind that seemed to drain color from the world below. The sidewalks glistened with leftover sleet, and the shop windows along Main Street reflected a sleepy stillness. Inside Walter's repair shop, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. The scent of engine oil mingled with cinnamon. Walter had taken to heating cider in an old saucepan by the radiator. He claimed it was for the moisture, but truthfully it reminded him of holidays long buried beneath grief. Sonny lay near the back of the shop just outside the plywood pen. He was more alert now, less skeletal, his fur cleaner and his eyes brighter. The wound on his hind leg had started to scar over, and though he still moved with a slight limp, his steps were steadier. Beside him, curled into a fuzzy comma, Toby snored softly. The little pup had filled out quickly with a round belly and perpetually wagging tail. He followed Sonny like a shadow, often tripping over his own paws, just trying to keep up. Walter stood at the workbench adjusting the distributor cap of a Ford that had stalled out 2 weeks back. He paused to glance at the dogs, a subtle smile softening the worn lines of his face. "Look at you two. Like brothers," he murmured. The bell above the front door jingled. Walter wiped his hands on a rag and stepped into the front of the shop. A couple stood just inside, shaking off the damp chill. The man was in his late 40s, average height with thinning blonde hair and a windbreaker several sizes too tight. His companion, a woman of similar age, wore high boots and a puffy purple coat. Her lipstick was a jarring shade of red, her eyes sharp with impatience. "Can I help you?" Walter asked. "We're looking for our dog," the woman said, her tone crisp. "We heard someone found a puppy out this way." Brown with white markings. Walter's jaw tightened. Could be a few like that. "Lost him recently, did you?" The man stepped forward, forcing a smile. "He slipped out of our yard last week. Our niece was watching him. We've been looking everywhere." Walter didn't respond right away. He studied them the way he might study a faulty fuel pump, watching for the sputter before the stall. "You got a photo?" The woman pulled out her phone, thumbed through some images, and held it out. The puppy in the photo looked vaguely like Toby, but it was blurry, the angle poor. "He's grown since then," she added quickly. "But that's definitely him." Walter didn't take the phone. He turned toward the back. "Dog's resting right now. Found him out by the woods. Rope around his neck, cold as stone." The man's smile wavered. "That's him, then. He chews through everything. We've been so worried." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Where'd he get the rope?" The woman's expression flickered. "Like I said, our niece. Maybe she tried to keep him tied in the yard. Kids do dumb things." From the back room came a low growl. The couple stiffened. Walter stepped aside as Sonny emerged, standing tall despite his thin frame. He positioned himself between the strangers and the shop's interior, his head, low eyes locked on the man's face. A deep, guttural sound rumbled from his throat, not loud but chillingly firm. Toby toddled in behind him, but Sonny moved a paw forward, blocking the pup's path. "Easy," the man said, backing up a step. "We're not here to hurt anyone." Walter didn't move. Funny. He's never growled at anyone before. Not even me. The woman's voice sharpened. "We're taking our dog. You don't have the right to keep him." "I don't," Walter replied calmly. "But the police will. So let's give them a ring." He reached for the landline on the wall. The couple looked at each other, eyes darting toward the door. The man took half a step backward. "Look, we don't want trouble. Just give us the dog and we'll leave." "That's the thing," Walter said, fingers dialing. "I think trouble's already here." The couple turned and bolted. Walter cursed under his breath and rushed to the door, watching them speed away in a gray sedan with out-of-state plates. He gave the license number to the dispatcher and hung up. "You did good, kid," he said to Sonny, who still stood in place, unmoving until the car disappeared. Then, slowly, he relaxed, nudging Toby gently toward the warmth of the shop again. By evening, news of the incident had made its way down the street. Maple Creek was small, and stories moved faster than traffic. That night, Walter heard a knock on his side door. It was Gertrude. Gertrude Evans lived 3 houses down a widow in her 70s with a spine like a ruler and opinions like wildfire. She was infamous for scolding teens over music volume and issuing handwritten complaints to the town council. Her gray hair was always in a tight bun, her posture so straight it looked painful. She was not known for kindness. Tonight, however, she held a USB flash drive in her gloved hand. "My security camera faces the road," she said, without preamble. "Picked up something you might find useful." Walter took the drive, puzzled. Gertrude glanced past him, her eyes softening just briefly at the sight of Sonny curled beside Toby. "I don't like dogs," she muttered almost to herself. "But that one," he stood between a child and a lie. "That counts for something." She left before Walter could reply. Inside, he loaded the footage onto his computer. The timestamp was from 5 nights prior. The video showed a beat-up gray sedan pulling onto the bridge. Headlights flashed. 2 shapes exited the vehicle. A small crate was tossed onto the ice. Then another. The car idled for 20 seconds, then sped off. Walter watched it twice. The second time, his jaw set tighter. He burned the footage to a disk and placed it beside the phone. That night, he sat by the heater while Sonny and Toby slept in a tangle of gold and brown fur. He felt a strange warmth behind his ribs, one that had nothing to do with cider or radiators. The town had shifted. People had noticed, and for once they weren't just passing by, they were choosing to care. The wind had a voice that day, a long, rising howl that whistled through the alleys of Maple Creek and rattled the windows like unseen hands shaking them from the outside. The temperature had dropped steadily since morning, and by dusk, thick snow was falling sideways in violent sheets, covering sidewalks, power lines, and rooftops in the suffocating white of a blizzard. The local radio station, the only one still broadcasting over AM, warned of power outages and issued a town-wide advisory to shelter in place. Walter had left the shop just after sunset, bundled in his old canvas coat, heading across the street to help a neighbor restart a diesel generator. Back in 10, he had told Sonny with a pat on the head. But the wind picked up, the snow turned to ice, and 10 minutes turned into an hour. Then the power went out. Eli and Sarah had been eating a late dinner when the lights flickered twice, then died completely. The sudden dark felt like a curtain being drawn over the entire world. The heater stopped. The fridge hummed its last breath and silence settled thick across the kitchen. Sarah Carter, tall and lean, with hair the color of burnished copper pulled into a practical ponytail, stood by the table, holding a flashlight in one hand, a worried expression painting her normally calm face. She had always been known for her composure, the kind of nurse who stayed level through emergencies and chaos alike. But since her husband's passing 2 winters ago, her grip on certainty had loosened. She'd learned to hide worry, to carry it in silence, like a sealed envelope tucked into her chest. Eli, still in his socks, stood by the window, watching snow lash sideways against the glass. "Sonny and Toby are in the shed," he said. Sarah glanced at him. "They'll be fine. Walter's probably there with them." "No," Eli said quietly. "He said he'd be back. I saw him go the other way." The flashlight trembled slightly in her grip. She hesitated. The house was getting colder by the minute. She wrapped a blanket around Eli's shoulders, pulled on her boots, and grabbed the keys. "We'll go check," she said, "but just for a bit, then we come straight back." Outside, the storm felt alive, an angry creature tearing through trees and howling down chimneys. Snow stuck to their clothes in seconds. Visibility barely reached past the tip of Sarah's flashlight. They trudged across the lot, the ground slippery beneath layers of ice, until the faint shape of Walter's repair shop loomed ahead like a ghost. The main garage was locked and dark, but behind it the shed glowed faintly. A small battery-powered lantern Walter had left cast a warm orange light inside, flickering gently like a candle in the cold. Sarah opened the door and stepped in with Eli close behind. The smell of old blankets and damp sawdust hit them first. Then they saw the dogs. Sonny lay curled against the far wall, his body draped protectively over Toby, who was fast asleep beneath him. Snow clung to Sonny's fur, and his chest rose and fell with effort. He looked up as they entered, eyes glassy but alert. He didn't move. He didn't bark. He simply watched. Sonny Eli whispered, kneeling near him, "You're freezing." Sarah knelt too, her knees brushing the sawdust. She reached out, running her hand along Sonny's back. The fur was damp, the skin beneath cold. But he didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned slightly into her touch. And then she saw it, something that cracked the tight wall she'd built around herself since her husband's funeral. Sonny's eyes. Not fearful, not expectant, but tired, gentle, and filled with something she hadn't seen in a long time in either man or beast responsibility. Despite his thin frame and scarred body, he had kept watch. Not for safety, not out of habit, but out of love. She felt the tears before she could stop them. They came silently, trailing down her cheeks and into the collar of her coat. She bent forward, pressing her forehead against Sonny's neck. He didn't move. "This isn't just a dog," she whispered. Eli wrapped his arms around Toby and looked up at her. "I know." They stayed there, the three of them, wrapped in blankets and each other's warmth. Sarah laid another thick quilt over Sonny and Toby, then wrapped herself around Eli, who had curled beside them like a quiet moon to a silent sun. Outside, the storm battered the walls. Inside, breath by breath, 4 hearts beat steady through the dark. Hours passed. Snow stacked high against the outer walls. The battery lantern dimmed until only its final pulse remained, casting the last flicker of light over Sonny's eyes before fading. But Sonny stayed awake. His head remained up, even as his body shook, even as his vision blurred. He stayed between the cold and the ones he had chosen to protect, the same way he once stood on that bridge alone, waiting for pain to end or love to return. Somewhere around dawn, Walter returned. His beard was thick with ice, his coat stiff from frozen sleet. He burst into the shed chest, heaving, ready to yell, until he saw them. Eli asleep beside Toby, Sarah sitting upright, eyes closed, arm around her son, and Sonny still watching. Walter stepped forward, removed his gloves, and whispered, "You old fool." But there was no scolding in his voice. Only something tender cracked at the edges. He set down a thermos of broth and a new blanket. He did not disturb them, he simply sat. And outside, the storm finally began to break. Maple Creek's town hall sat at the edge of the square like an aging bookend, with peeling white paint and ivy stubbornly clinging to the east wall. Normally, its courtroom handled little more than parking disputes, building permits, and the occasional neighborly feud over tree branches. But today it hummed with an energy that felt altogether different. The benches were filled not just with officials or reporters, but with townsfolk. People who hadn't stepped foot inside that room in years now sat shoulder to shoulder, scarves wrapped tight and eyes fixed forward. At the heart of it all stood a golden retriever who had once lain in the snow forgotten. Sonny. He entered through the side door, guided gently on a loose leash by Walter, who had borrowed a soft harness for the occasion. Sonny's fur, while still thin along his sides, had begun to grow back in patches of pale gold. His eyes were alert but calm, and though he walked with a faint limp, there was something quietly regal in the way he held himself, as if he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. Beside him walked Eli, holding tightly to his notebook, lips pressed in a determined line. He wore his best jacket, still a size too big, but his posture had none of the slouch that marked his grief in earlier months. Something had shifted. The judge presiding over the case was Harold Beckman, a man in his late 50s with a slow, deliberate cadence to his voice and a gaze that rarely blinked. Balding and broad, he wore spectacles with gold rims and had once worked as a public defender in Denver before retiring early to Maple Creek for a quieter life. Known for his fairness and love of classical music, he had a way of silencing a room just by raising a single brow. On the other side of the courtroom sat the accused, the couple who had claimed Toby now exposed for their cruelty. They looked less confident today. The man, Darren Cross, wore a cheap suit and tapped one foot incessantly. The woman, Margot, avoided eye contact, her red lipstick now faded and uneven. Their lawyer, an out-of-town representative in a dark overcoat, kept whispering instructions that were met with nervous nods. Walter sat behind Sonny, flanked by Sarah and Eli. Sarah had brought along a small thermos of tea and wore her nurse scrubs beneath a warm coat, hair tied into a low bun. She didn't speak, but her gaze was fixed and fierce. She'd seen enough pain in her life to recognize when someone tried to dismiss it. The trial began with the presentation of evidence, the USB footage provided by Mrs. Gertrude Evans. The video was played on a small monitor at the front of the room. It was silent, grainy, and time-stamped, but unmistakable. It showed the gray sedan pulling onto the wooden bridge. The crate, the smaller shape thrown behind it. Then, the slow reverse of the car before it disappeared into the darkness. Gasps rippled through the audience. Gertrude herself had taken the stand earlier that day. She wore a navy shawl, her posture ramrod straight as always. "I don't like dogs," she had declared plainly, "but I like people who lie even less." A vet report followed documenting the condition of both dogs when they arrived at Walter's shop. Malnutrition, frostbite, scarring, the rope marks on the pup's neck. Then came the moment no one expected. "Call Sonny to the stand," the bailiff said, smiling faintly as if unsure how else to say it. There was a pause, then quiet laughter around the room, gentle, not mocking. Walter led Sonny to the front leash, loose in his grip. Eli stood beside him, clutching his notebook. The judge looked over his glasses. "I understand this is symbolic, but symbolism matters." He looked at Sonny. "You've made quite an impression, young man." Sonny sat straight-backed. Eli placed a hand on his shoulder. The judge leaned slightly forward. "This dog," he said, voice steady, "did not run when he had the chance. He stood between a child and danger. He protected when he himself had been abandoned. That is not just animal instinct, that is character." Murmurs of agreement echoed behind the benches. Outside, the courthouse posters fluttered in the wind. "Let Sonny stay," they read, scrawled in bold colors and children's handwriting. The online campaign had started 2 nights before, initiated quietly by Eli and boosted by Walter's niece, who lived out of state and worked in digital marketing. Within 48 hours, the hashtag had gone viral. Teachers printed petitions. Cafes placed jars on counters for donations. Even the gas station put up a paw print decal on their glass door. More than 6,000 people had signed, some from as far as Oregon and Ohio. Judge Beckman cleared his throat. "There's no legal dispute about the abandonment. The evidence is clear. The animal cruelty charges will proceed to state court." He paused. "As for custody, this court recognizes that Walter Hargrove has assumed care with community support, and with this court's blessing, Sonny will remain in Maple Creek permanently." Applause broke out. It was brief but heartfelt. Sonny didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark or leap. He merely turned his head toward Eli, leaned his body against the boy's side, and let out a soft breath, relieved, finally to be wanted. Outside, snow had begun to fall again. Gentle, this time like the sky exhaling. That evening, Sarah, Eli, and Walter returned to the shop. They brought Sonny and Toby bowls of warm stew and spread fresh blankets in the shed, though Sonny now often wandered between the shed and Walter's main office, where a bed had been prepared just for him. On the corkboard by the register, Walter pinned a printed copy of the petition. Above it, in blue ink, someone had scrawled, "Courage is not the absence of scars, it's what you do with them after." Spring came slowly to Maple Creek, brushing the snow from rooftops and warming the wooden porch planks one golden morning at a time. The river behind town, once locked in ice, now rippled gently under soft sunlight, and robins had returned to the bare branches that lined the gravel roads. Life had found its rhythm again, and in a quiet house tucked behind Walter's auto shop, that rhythm pulsed through every small moment a splash of a water bowl, the sound of laughter, the thud of paws against the earth. Sonny now lay stretched across the sun-drenched grass of Walter's backyard, his fur once matted and thin, now a rich honey gold, smooth and clean beneath the light. His body had filled out lean but strong, and the once sharp bones of his hips were no longer visible. The scar on his hind leg remained a faded testament to where he'd come from, but even that had softened as if the warmth had finally reached the place where pain had settled long ago. His eyes were no longer guarded. They shone. Beside him, Toby tumbled across the yard in a burst of puppy energy, chasing a squeaky tennis ball with legs too short and excitement too big. He was bigger now, nearly 5 months old, with smooth chestnut fur and a white blaze across his nose that made him look like he'd run through a stroke of paint. His ears still flopped lopsided when he ran, and his bark, though growing bolder, carried the innocence of someone who had never known true fear. Eli laughed from the porch leg swinging off the edge as he watched them. He wore a light hoodie jeans with a patch sewn by his mother, and the same scuffed boots he'd used to sneak across the snow all those months ago. His notebook sat beside him, pages fluttering in the breeze. The cover was worn smudged with fingerprints and paw prints. Across the top in black pen read The Journal of Sonny and Toby by Eli Carter, age 10. Behind him, Walter stepped out carrying a tray with lemonade and dog biscuits. He still wore his usual olive work shirt and jeans, but there was more color in his cheeks now, more softness around his eyes. He had taken to keeping the back door open when the dogs played, always pretending it was for air. But Sarah had caught him more than once, just standing at the threshold smiling at the sounds of paws on grass. Sarah Carter had changed too, no longer just the nurse who moved through life like it was something she had to keep from slipping. Now she laughed more easily, even if it was quiet. Her long days at the clinic were followed by evenings in Walter's kitchen, helping with dinner or drinking tea, while Eli finished his homework. She wore her auburn hair down more often and had added a set of wind chimes to her porch ones that chimed softly in the late afternoon, and made the house feel less like a place in mourning and more like a place becoming whole again. Walter officially adopted Sonny a week after the court's decision. The paperwork had been simple, but the moment had felt monumental. He'd stood outside the clerk's office, leash in one hand, adoption certificate in the other, and whispered, "You're home now, kid." Sarah adopted Toby the same day. She let Eli write the name on the form. Toby Carter he'd printed carefully smiling, as he dotted the I with a small paw print he drew himself. When they walked out of the building, Sarah bent down to kiss Toby's head. "No one's ever going to hurt you again," she told him. "Not while we're breathing." That night, the two dogs slept on the same bed, one head resting over the other's back. Eli had taken a photo and taped it to the first page of his notebook. The notebook didn't stay a notebook for long. Walter's niece, Rebecca, who worked for a small publishing company in Denver, had visited during spring break. She was in her early 30s, vibrant and quick-witted, with glasses too large for her face, and a laugh that filled the kitchen. She read the journal in one sitting, sitting cross-legged on the porch with tears running down her cheeks by the last page. "This is beautiful," she said to Eli, voice hoarse. "It needs to be a book." Eli blinked. "You mean, like, for real?" Rebecca nodded. "For real. Kids need stories like this." With Sarah's approval and Walter's quiet encouragement, Rebecca worked with Eli over the next month, editing, formatting, and choosing illustrations from a local artist who specialized in animal sketches. The final result was a soft-cover children's book titled Sunny and Toby, the Bridge, the Blizzard, and the Backyard. The cover showed two dogs side by side looking out over a wooden bridge under a starry sky. The book launched quietly through local shops and online, but word spread fast. By summer, schools across Colorado requested copies for their classrooms. Libraries stocked it in their animal-themed reading corners. Letters poured in from children who had rescued pets or wanted to. Eli read every one. He didn't think of himself as a writer, just a boy who had once looked out a window and saw someone who needed him. That afternoon in Walter's backyard, Eli leaned back and watched as Sunny trotted to the ball Toby had dropped, picked it up gently, and turned back. Toby barked in excitement, chasing after him, and the two disappeared behind the shed in a blur of gold and brown. Eli opened his journal again and began writing the next line. Today, Sunny finally let Toby win. Walter chuckled from the porch, handing Eli a glass. "You gonna write about me in there?" Eli grinned. "Only the good parts." Sarah appeared in the doorway behind them. "That narrows it down." Walter pretended to groan, but his smile lingered. And across the yard, where the wind carried laughter and the sound of paws beating against the earth, Sunny looked up from his game of chase, glanced toward the boy on the porch, and for a single moment, just long enough to matter, closed his eyes as if to say, "I remember everything, and I am at peace." Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or flashes of light. Sometimes they come quietly wrapped in golden fur, walking with a limp, waiting on an old wooden bridge. Sunny's story reminds us that no soul is too broken to be healed, and no heart too lost to be found. What was once discarded became the very thing that brought healing to a boy, a family, and a whole town. That is the kind of redemption only love, and perhaps God, can offer. In our daily lives, we often rush past moments that could be divine in disguise: a stranger who needs a kind word, a child looking for comfort, or a silent animal hoping for warmth. Maybe, just maybe, that's God nudging us gently. So take a moment to pause, to care to believe. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us what moment moved you most. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories of love, loyalty, and second chances. And if you believe that God still works through the small and the forgotten, comment Amen below. May God bless you and all the creatures you've ever loved.